just as a sort of brief introduction, I suppose, I've been at the museum now for 20 years. So I've worked with this collection during that time. And the basis of this talk was a talk I gave to the Sussex Mineral Show back in 2011. And as you've alluded to a few members slightly earlier, that was kind of everything we knew about the collection, or everything we thought we knew about the collection. But during lockdown, I was provided with 2 handwritten catalogues, which were essentially the first edition of Bob King's collection. And these 2 catalogues, which we weren't aware of in the museum, turned out to have lots of detailed information within them, which we simply weren't aware of. And so that original talk from 2011 has now been quite dramatically altered. So I've spent the last few days updating the talk, and much of the last few weeks going through the catalogues to try and decipher new pieces of information. And in essence, my original talk has essentially completely changed with this new information, which I'll be providing today. So, as you're obviously want to move this window of images of people on my screen. Let me just try and get this to go back. I've got images over my text. There we go. All right. So some of you may have met Bob over the years. I say its title was R.J. King Collection. So it's Robert Joseph King, who was born in the 1920s in Leicestershire. And very much his interest was spurred quite early on. So I think he was about the age of 8 in the early 1930s that he got interested in minerals. Being born and bred in Leicester, his main interest was pretty much obviously the East Midlands, so that sort of area, the vicinity of places which were easily accessible to him. And then as he got a little bit older, he liked to diversify, as many people do, and spread out and travel around the British Isles collecting minerals. And the places he went to, probably familiar with a lot of you if you're interested in minerals, so Cumbrian iron mines, North Pennines lead mines, the Coolbeck Fells in the Lake District. So they were some of his more popular collecting sites. As he got a little bit older, there was the outbreak of World War II, and this, as with anyone at the time, completely disrupted his life and disrupted his collecting. He was posted out to North Africa and then shortly afterwards to Italy. But he very much saw that as an opportunity to continue collecting. And so he brought back huge volumes of material from Italy, which can still be seen within his collection. Many of his very best specimens came about from his own collecting and the ability at that time to visit mines which were still working. So we had, in the early 20th century, a lot of mines working during the First World War, which then closed, but were reopened because of supply and demand during the Second World War. And many of those mines continued to be open in the late 1940s after the war. So he was very much fortunate to be of this era where there were mines still available to collect in. And he was also at the point where mineral collecting was a slightly unusual pastime. And so there wasn't all that much competition between people going out and collecting. So much so that he recalled stories of going to the famous collecting areas of the Coolbeck Fells in the Lake District and finding so many specimens that he'd leave behind some of them on rocks. And then when he returned a year or two later, those same specimens were still sat there for him to look at. During his collecting, he befriended many collectors throughout the UK, but also further afield, so places like the United States. And from this, he benefited from numerous donations, the most significant of which was the colossal collection of Professor Harwood, which I'll talk about in detail later on. When I gave this talk originally, about 10 years ago, I was very much under the impression that the vast majority of his collection either came from Harwood or was self-collected. Now, with the knowledge of these new catalogues, these First King catalogues, which have been handed to me, it appears that his collection was very much a collection of collections, and the actual volume of material which he self-collected is far less than we'd originally thought. So, go back to the beginning. So when Bob was a child, he was 8 years old when he said he first got interested in collecting minerals. And during the 1930s, so his early teens, he attended Vaughan College in Leicester, which was essentially a working men's institute. And at this college, he came across a H. Gregory, who was the honorary curator of the museum there. And Gregory must have put some considerable interest into Bob's collecting. He encouraged him, as we can see from this extract from his early catalogue. You can see at the bottom there, it says, given by Gregory from museum reject material. And the column in the middle is the date that he was given that, so November 1935. So he would have been just 12, 13 years old at that point. And again, the line at the top is another one given by H. Gregory in 1938. And I could rattle through page after page from this catalogue of samples which were given to him by this Gregory. And a large number of them are recorded as museum reject material. So Gregory was essentially giving away parts of the duplicate material from the museum to essentially a child, but it obviously led to Bob's fascination and his interest in minerals. We move forward to World War II. The outbreak of the war, Bob was just 16 years of age. This is something I've not really looked at in too much detail until fairly recently. And this again casts doubt on some of the dates of specimens which he or the museum thought that he had self-collected. For the first few years of the war, because of Bob's age, he wasn't called up, and records show that he remained in Leicester, and he attended evening classes at the same college, classes which I think were given by Gregory in geology and mineralogy, and these attracted a wide range of the population, wide range of audience from the Leicestershire area. And one of the people he encountered during these evening classes was a Mr. Raymond Walsh, of whom he went out and described visiting many mines around the British Isles. Then, shortly after this, Bob was called up to serve for his country, first of all in North Africa, about which I know very little, but then shortly afterwards, his service took him to Italy, and he was involved in the Monte Cassino raid, where the Allies tried to retake Rome. In fact, did retake Rome, but with enormous casualties. But whilst Bob was there, I mentioned earlier that he used his war service during the war as essentially a way of still collecting minerals. And we have here, so the extract at the bottom there shows, it just reads, collected during leave period from Palestine. So it shows that after the war, so in November 1945, he must have been sent from Italy over to the Middle East and was still collecting minerals. Other pages within his catalogue note quite frequently specimens which were exchanged for food with the principal of Perugia High School in Italy. So clearly, if Bob had mineral specimens and he's recording they were exchanged for food, he must have been giving his rations to the Italians in exchange for mineral specimens, which seems quite fascinating. He obviously survived the war, survived without any injuries, as far as I'm aware. And on his return, his collection expanded rapidly, partly because he was obviously able then to get out into the field and collect. And a lot of the mines, as I said, in Britain were still working at that point. But with the discovery of this new catalogue, it appears that most of his acquisitions were through donations. So it was quite clear that he was exchanging, so he was giving specimens to other collectors, other mineral dealers, and receiving material back, or just being given samples from people who knew that he was interested in mineral collecting. And one of the main players in this was the chap I've mentioned who he met at the evening classes, so Raymond Walsh. And he's such an important character. I'll delve into, I'll show you a bit more detail about him shortly. Bob was also developing a network with other UK-based mineral collectors. Some names which you may be familiar with. So there's Bill Davidson, who was the Cumbrian mineral dealer, famous for collecting around the Colbeck Fells. Arthur Scoble, who's based in Oakhampton in Devon. A.E. Seeger, I think he's Arthur again, but I need to check his first name, who was a lecturer at, I think it's University College London, and also Sir Arthur Russell, who everyone at that time was familiar with, provided him with a small number of specimens. However, one of the really interesting things that's come to light with these first drafts of his early collection catalogue is that he appears to have acquired many old museum collections, the circumstances of which are as yet to be resolved. The first of these was from Bootle Museum in Merseyside, which he appears to have acquired in about 1957. I was already aware of this collection and I quizzed him about that. And apparently it was thrown out when Bootle Museum closed. So presumably it closed in the late 1950s and is still closed to this day. But quite how Bob came to acquire them is unexplained. Then there was a large collection of old-time minerals from Denston School, which is a private school in Derbyshire, the Staffordshire-Derbyshire borders, Derbyshire. And he acquired their collection in about 1959. Again, under what circumstances is not yet known. But all of these collections appear to have been very rich in classic, what I would term old-time, really important, significant old British mineral specimens. And he also appears to have added regular entries in his catalogue as rejects from Leicester Museum and rejects from University College Leicester, both of which he was affiliated with. So following the war, Bob worked first of all as a dairyman, working in the fields and in farming, and later joined the Department of Geology at Leicester University as a technician and progressed up to the ranks to chief technician. Moving forward slightly, so during the early 1950s was when Bob first met Professor Henry Harwood, who was a retired chemistry lecturer from, I think it was University College London, no, Imperial College London, and he is integral to the significance of Bob's main collection. Bob also became good friends with the Somerset-based mineral dealer, Reginald Parkinson, who was then made godfather to Bob and Sally's son. Parkinson gave Bob many specimens from 1959 onwards, not just Mendip minerals, but also from worldwide occurrences. As I said earlier, Bob also developed a network with collectors in the US, so presumably he was parceling up specimens, sending them to the States, and then receiving a lot of American material in return. In the 1960s, Bob was already on the staff at Leicester University, but in 1964 he was appointed curator at the Department of Geology at Leicester University. He had no formal training in geology or mineralogy, but his own collecting and volunteer work at Leicester Museum and Art Gallery and his prior work within the geology department had stood him in good stead. He quickly realised that there had actually been very little published on the mineralogy of Leicestershire, and so set about publishing numerous articles on the minerals of Leicestershire. This interest in Leicestershire mineralogy expanded and grew, and led eventually to him led eventually to him submitting a PhD thesis entitled The Mineralogy of Leicestershire. At that point, he would have been, I think, 50 years of age, so it was quite late to be submitting a PhD, but obviously based around his interests rather than for work-related reasons. It was also around about this time, in October 1972, that Bob instigated the foundation of a new society for those who were interested in mineralogy in Leicestershire. And that society he named, or the group named after Sir Arthur Russell. So it was the Russell Society, which is still going today. And it was set up because, in much the same way Bob had attended evening classes and shown his interest in mineralogy in the 1930s, there was a burgeoning group of enthusiasts in Leicester, based in and around Leicester in the 1970s, and quite a number of mineral dealers set up shops in the area. And so Bob and a few others gave evening classes to do with mineralogy in that area. And they all decided that because there was so much interest, that they should set up this society. Bob was elected the first president, so he served for the first two years, and continued to be an active committee member for many years after this. The society expanded with numerous other branches throughout the British Isles, and when Bob eventually moved to South Wales, in the Vale of Glamorgan near Cardiff, he then established a new branch, a new South Wales branch in 1983. So I'd alluded to this person, Raymond C. Walsh, as quite a significant person that Bob met at evening classes. Now, we need to remember that Bob would have been late teens, early 20s max when he was attending these evening classes. This photograph of Raymond Walsh would have been from a similar time, so he's clearly quite a bit older than Bob. But the two of them obviously got on very well, had mutual interests in mineralogy, and they would go off collecting around the British Isles, quite often to mines that Walsh would get them access to. And Walsh had an absolutely stunning collection. He was good friends with Dr. Wilbert Goodchild, who was a medical doctor who opened and ran the Blancathra Sanatorium near Keswick in Cumbria. Goodchild's father, John George Goodchild, was a survey geologist, British survey geologist based up in Edinburgh, and also had established a very fine mineral collection, which had obviously passed to his son. And then because of Walsh's links to Goodchild, he appears to have inherited these collections. Walsh also appears to have acquired specimens from other famous collectors at that point, Arthur Scoble, Arthur Raystrick, who was the industrial historian in Yorkshire, and Amos Trelaw. Captain Amos Trelaw was a famous mine owner, mine manager in northern England. But I mentioned that Walsh was a very interesting character. He went missing after World War II. And Bob recalls that he was, after he'd come back from the war, he was working on a farm, he was driving a tractor, ploughing a field, and a gentleman was gesturing to him to stop because he needed to talk. And Bob shouted out the window he couldn't stop because he was being paid by the hour, and he couldn't afford, it's more than his job's worth to stop. And so the man hung around. At the end of Bob's shift, he introduced himself as being from MI5 or MI6, one or the other, and asked whether he knew anything about this Walsh. And of course, Bob was quite open about the fact they'd gone collecting around various mines. And it appears, as Bob was already aware, that Walsh never went to serve during the war. He had a written exemption allowing him to stay in Britain to survey the mines. But it turns out that this exemption was written by the Germans. And so he'd been all along spying at the British mines, whilst also collecting mineral specimens, which ended up going to Bob's collection. So Walsh appears after the war to have fled to South Africa, never to be seen again. But obviously, in fleeing the country, his collection was left behind, and 569 specimens attributed to Walsh have now been found listed in this early catalogue of Bob's. So a fascinating story and a fascinating set of historic specimens. So these are a few examples from Walsh's collection. So a lot of it is classic, really old-time material. And Walsh must have been very meticulous in keeping details of where and when these specimens had come from. The chalcocydite on the right there is particularly fine, but is probably more important because it has a date attributed to it. So 1875, obviously pre when Walsh could have collected it himself, but he would possibly have inherited it from Goodchild, maybe from Amos Trelaw. So we've got snippets of information showing that some of Walsh's material is really historically important. But the other aspect of Walsh's material is the fact that it appears to have inherited over 100 specimens from Wilbert Goodchild. I say Wilbert Goodchild had inherited from his father, so a lot of his mineral specimens dated back to the late 1800s. So again, really important historic material. John George Goodchild, so Wilbert Goodchild's father, as I mentioned, was a professional geologist based with the survey up in Scotland, and he was heavily involved in the posthumous publication of Matthew Heddle's Mineralogy of Scotland. And there's at least 5 specimens within the King collection which we were previously unaware of, which are now attributed to Heddle based on this new information. And there's also a nice piece of information linking a very early graphite specimen from the Pencil mine in Borrowdale to Postlethwaite, who was again an early geologist in the Lake District. So some really, really interesting material. Here's a couple of examples of John George Goodchild specimens. So one on the left from the Corbeck Fells. So he would have almost certainly self-collected this at a point when it was still possible to find this sort of quality of material. And the one on the right, a Belton grain vanadinite. I need to double check this when I've got time, but I suspect that this is a Heddle specimen because Matthew Heddle had large quantities of material from Lead Hills, One Head area. So the most important aspect of Bob's collection was that which related to Professor Henry Harwood. So when Bob met Harwood in the 1950s, Professor Harwood had already retired. He'd retired to North Wales, he lived in a big house in Deganwy near Llandudno, and had a colossal, very large and very high quality private collection, which was known to the authorities because of its significance. So it was a collection which had almost been designated with such importance that the Natural History Museum had to be aware of what happened when Harwood died. It was such a significant collection. So Harwood and Bob shared a similar passion for minerals and grew to become very good friends. And it's recorded, and having talked to Bob, he used to go and spend days on end in the summer, going up and staying with Harwood, discussing minerals. And looking at these early catalogues, Harwood would send large quantities of specimens from new discoveries or new acquisitions to Bob, and Bob would reciprocate by giving him anything new that he'd found. Bob started receiving specimens from Harwood from 1952 onwards, but his donations increased substantially from 1968 on the basis of these early catalogues we found. And that was very much towards Harwood's old age. And so it appears that Harwood was already deciding where his collection should go. And indeed, when Harwood died in 1974 at the age of 88, he bequeathed half of his collection to Bob. This had been pre-arranged, so Bob had already gone and marked up which specimens he wanted. Some of them had already gone to Bob, he'd already chosen them and taken them while Harwood was still alive. And the remainder of Harwood's collection was gifted by bequest to Manchester Museum and Manchester University, where Harwood studied as an undergraduate. Harwood's collection, as I say, represented one of the finest collections of British minerals in private hands, probably second only at the time to Sir Arthur Russell's collection. Additionally, he exchanged worldwide, and he exchanged for incredibly high quality specimens. He had a specific interest in cassiterite. So he was employed during, I think it was the First World War, to carry out a study for the Ministry of Defence or Ministry of Supply on tin supplies. And on that basis, he acquired cassiterite specimens, or tin oxide specimens, from pretty much every single locality in the world. I think his collection of cassiterite numbers over 900 specimens, so a huge, huge number. It also got an interest in pretty minerals, so he had some beautiful smoky quartzes from the Alps, as well as a considerable amount of showy, beautifully coloured and well crystallised fluorite specimens. As I say, the collection was believed or known to be of national importance and had been valued by Peter Embry, who was the curator of minerals at the Natural History Museum in 1975, just for insurance purposes and to keep an eye on where the collection was. Interestingly enough, Embry concluded that the average quality of the specimens is good, although with a few exceptions, not exceptional. That's probably compared to what the Natural History Museum had, but compared to any other museum in the land, they would have been incredibly good. The total value of the collection at that point was valued at £19,500, which seems like peanuts nowadays. If we were to equate that through in most money calculators, that would come out at about £150,000 in today's money. But when you think of how property values have gone up and other aspects of how money has changed, and also the mineral market, how that has developed into essentially minerals being works of art rather than just rocks, we could probably safely say that some individual specimens within Harwood's collection would fetch £150,000 on their own today. So a massive underestimate compared to modern values. Harwood created his own labelling system. So he had these star-shaped labels. So on that image there on the right-hand side, you can see a Harwood label, which he attached to his specimens. Peter Embry, as a curator, quite liked that idea, thought it was a very important feature of the collection, which many people at that time, many collectors at that time weren't doing. But looking at that label, it's quite often vague. So just a single mineral name and a vague sort of locality, I suppose this one's probably a bad example. Some of them are just named after the county, and so they're not brilliant in terms of his system. And what Bob had picked up on was that quite often Harwood wouldn't be interested in the old labels. So if he acquired old-time specimens from other collectors, he wouldn't have much regard for the original labels, which Bob really didn't like. But when Bob tried to question Harwood and change his ways, he was told in no uncertain terms that he should know where every specimen is from without a label, which is all very well, but if your entire collection is so important and then you die, how is anyone supposed to know where you self-collected things from? So quite short-sighted, I think, of Harwood. But prior to his death, Harwood had primed Bob King ready to house the considerable quantity of specimens that would eventually be coming his way. He wrote in letters to Bob that he simply could not keep his specimens upstairs in his house. He would have to find somewhere with a suitably solid floor. And when in 1975 it came to Bob removing his share of Harwood's bequest, he had to use a furniture removal van to transport the collection, which he had to house at Leicester University because he didn't have space at home. Bob, in his usual sort of curatorial type ways, produced catalogue after catalogue for the collection, And this is an example of the catalogue which we have in the museum, the original catalogue. Now, the numbers on the left-hand side, which relate to Bob's numbering system, what I now know, they bear no resemblance whatsoever to the new King, the early King catalogue, which has just come into my possession. And so it's clear that Bob established his first collection on the basis of all the previous collections he's acquired. And then because Harwood's collection was so significant, he then recatalogued everything with new numbers, which is going to cause complications when I finally get back to the collection and try and decipher how the two catalogues relate. So he reassembled his collection to incorporate the significant Harwood pieces, and he attached his own handwritten labels to each specimen. So the example here is a livermite from Real Unity in Cornwall, is a typical Bob King label. So every one of Bob King's specimens in the museum has a similar style label affixed to the base of it. Now, Bob was now all too aware of the importance of the collection he now owned, having half of Harwood's collection plus all the historic material he had before. And so he very rapidly had to consider what his own long-term future for the collection would be. Bearing in mind he inherited the collection when he was in his mid-50s, he had intended going down the route of bequeathing all of the British material to the individual museums for that country. So all the Scottish material to the Royal Scottish Museum, or the Welsh to the National Museum of Wales, and English material to the Natural History Museum. And so that was very much his thinking throughout the 1970s. But then in 1970, Bob suffered a major health scare, and that obviously galvanized his thoughts, and he needed to think fast what he would do with his collection. And at a similar time, the National Museum of Wales had got wind of what he was planning in terms of splitting up the collections. And the National Museum of Wales at the time, their collection was very much poor. National Museum, you might not be aware, but it's one of the youngest of the national museums in Britain. Founded in 1907, the museum building itself wasn't constructed until the 1920s. And so consequently, the collections there didn't really have much historic pedigree. They tended to be things which had been acquired in the 20th century. And so the National Museum approached Bob to ascertain what his long-term plans were, whether they remained the same, and to try and pave the way for an audacious bid to buy the entire collection, because they knew that it would essentially make the National Museum of Wales's mineral collection into something national or international in scope, rather than essentially what it was, which was a provincial museum's grade collection. At the same time, Leicester University were pressuring Bob into early retirement, and of course his collection was stored at the university, and so its future became quite uncertain. And so Bob agreed to essentially sell his collection to the National Museum of Wales, who had to go and get 3 independent valuations done. So these were done in 1983, and the rest, as I say, is history. The price was agreed and it was purchased. The collection consisted of 3 main parts: the main collection, so that was all of his best material plus Harwood's; a reserve collection, so essentially what Bob had classed as an exchange collection; and then finally his Leicestershire research collection. So this was all the material which kind of led to his PhD thesis on mineralogy of Leicestershire. After that, so after he'd sold his collection, he then re-established, he set up a new collection called the New King Collection, which has obviously since been dispersed as well. But I won't discuss any of that in this talk. That's entirely separate, and none of that went to the National Museum of Wales, because it was slightly later on. Bob's main collection comprised just over 9,000 specimens, about 6,000 of which would have come from Harwood originally. And that main collection was lock, stock and barrel accession straight into the museum's main mineral collection. Bob had wanted it to be kept as an entirely separate collection, but it was put into the same ordering system as the rest of the museum's collection. And I say contained the very best specimens from both Bob King's original collection and Professor Harwood's collection. And it transformed the National Museum of Wales's mineral collection into one of national importance, with significant international specimens embedded within that. And without it, I can quite honestly say that the National Museum of Wales's mineral collection would be incredibly poor. There are a few old-time historic collections there, but really nothing in comparison with other national museums. And so Bob King's and Harwood's joint collection really transformed what the National Museum of Wales had. So, time to look at some specimens. So, mentioned that a huge number of Bob's specimens were always assumed to have been self-collected, simply because in his museum catalogue, the catalogue we already have, there's dates attributed to a lot of the specimens. It's always been figured that those were the dates when Bob collected them, which showed that he had multiple trips to the Colbeck Fells in the early 1940s. So when the war had started, but before he'd been called up. But Bob, if you look at the dates, Bob would have been 18, 19, 20-ish during that sort of time period. And so it's striking me as a bit of a grey area as to whether Bob really did collect so many of these specimens, or whether the dates relate to when Raymond Walsh collected things and then they subsequently ended up in Bob's possession. It was always assumed, most collectors around Britain, when I first moved to the National Museum of Wales, always said, oh, the fantastic pyromorphites from Rowton Gill that you've got in the King collection were all collected by Bob during the war years. Having talked to Bob, the vast majority of the really good Colbeck Fells specimens he had were not self-collected. So even by the 1940s, the Colbeck Fells were stripped of anything decent, unless you were willing to go deep underground. Most of the dump material had already been picked over by mineral dealers, probably in the late 1800s. Bob also had some beautiful plumber gummites in the collection, but again, having talked to Bob, he only ever collected one himself, and that itself was very poor quality. And judging by the date he collected it, he would have been about 19 years old. So it was clear that the good old days had already passed, even by the time he was collecting there. He had some wonderful material from the North Pennines. Now, some of these probably were self-collected. So the baryta calcites from underground at Nensbury Hags Mine, which had been reworked at that point, and also baryta calcite from the type locality at Blagill was still accessible to him to be able to go and collect off the dumps. Bob's collection, out of all the different minerals there, one of the ones which, if you ask a lot of collectors about Bob King's collection, that will be mentioned is fluorite, and it is one of the most significant aspects of the King and the Harwood collections is the north of England fluorites. A lot of these were self-collected by Bob, so he obviously got access to Rotherhope Mine, these two examples here, near Ulston, in the late 1940s. So this would have been a mine, again, which had reopened during the war years and would have still been accessible to Bob when he came back after the war. Not the best image, I have to say, but the Stotfield Burn fluorites, the combinations of fluorite and galena that he has from Stotfield Burn are absolutely exceptional. The quality, the luster of the fluorites is you can't really describe it. You can't really capture them with photography. They are absolutely amazing, and a very unusual locality. So there's very few of these Stotfield Burn specimens in existence anywhere. Bob and Harwood seem to have the lion's share. Whether or not Bob collected them and gave them to Harwood has been suggested here. I need to go back now and double check these early catalogues. This stunning amber fluorite from Hilton Mine, near what's known as the Escarpment, so on the very western side of the North Pennines, in what would have been Westmoreland. This is very gemmy, very large, one of the largest in existence, one of the largest known, and reputedly collected by Bob in 1948 and gifted to Harwood. who then obviously gave by bequest his collection back to Bob King. So an interesting roundabout route of the way the specimen has gone. Also reputed that Bob had collected large quantities of beautiful specimens from the West Cumbrian iron mines. But again, looking back at these dates, Palaflat's mine, 1937, Bob would have been 14 years old. So some of these dates now suggest that that perhaps they were coming via Walsh, who was a little bit older, and then came to Bob King later on. But Walsh had recorded the dates, and then when he entered Bob's catalogues, the dates associated with the specimens got corrupted, and people then started to think that Bob had collected them himself. So again, more research needs to be done to definitively work out whether Bob was visiting all of these mines, or whether it was just that the curation of the specimens was so good beforehand that the dates, specific dates, were kept and then recorded by Bob. He had appears to have had several trips to Scotland, particularly to Strontian, where he collected some beautiful harmatone crystals in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s. Also Brewsterite, so from the type locality. The majority of his specimens appear to have come via Harwood, despite the dates suggesting that Bob self-collected them. So whether or not this is again a roundabout route where Bob collected the specimens, gave them to Harwood, and then received them back later on, needs to be thoroughly investigated to really work out what has happened there. North of England, so Northumberland, so further north in the North Pennines, beautiful bladed barytes on witherite from Settlingstone's mine. Also some very large galena crystals from Swinehope mine. And some of these reportedly were collected on trips with his friend Reg Parkinson. Beautiful barytes. One on the left is not so beautiful, but he's enormous. So that's 16 centimeters long. So you can imagine as barite is very dense, the weight of that specimen. Also the example on the right there from Silverband mine, which is very, in fact, from the same locality. So Silverband worked underground, and then during the 1960s, I think it was open cast. So it would have been quite easy for Bob to collect from open cast workings some quite substantial, and in the case of the one on the right there, quite gemmy crystals. This lovely yellow-tipped barite from Cowgreen mine, again, has been attributed to Bob King in the early 1940s. But again, it seems more likely that either he collected it with Raymond Walsh, or the fact that perhaps Raymond Walsh collected it himself, logged the date, and then when Bob acquired the Walsh collection after the war, he then kept the date with it, and it's been corrupted and has looked as though Bob collected it himself. Also got a number of dated specimens from Ireland, so classic, very heavy jackstraw cerussite from Tina mine on the left there, collected in the 1960s, and also topaz from the Diamond Rocks, the Granite Mountains, the Mourne Mountains in County Down, again 1963. So you can imagine that Bob might have had a tour of Ireland during that year. Closer to home, so Bob obviously based around Leicester, did a lot of collecting in Derbyshire. So there's many specimens in his collection listed as collected during the 1940s, 50s and 60s. So it does appear highly likely that he was having regular trips up into the Peak District to collect minerals. And he had lots and lots of these superb calcite crystals from Ryber mine, with inclusions of chalcopyrite and other sulfides. Another mineral from that area which he had large quantities of were orichalcite, so beautiful turquoisey blue mineral from Golconda mine, which was being explored by mine explorers during the 1960s. Even closer to home, so Staffordshire and Nottinghamshire, he he almost certainly collected the one on the left there from Fold Mine, the anhydrite and gypsum mine in Staffordshire, based on the date, because that was 1978. The one on the right is listed as self-collected by Bob, but he would have been 11 years old. So it's not implausible that he collected that. I think the East Bridgeford occurrence is a river section, so it's possible that that he did self-collect that as a child, if his parents had took him on a field trip. In terms of Welsh specimens, there's a number of great Orme copper minerals, so malachite, chalcopyrite, those sorts of things, and lots of calcites from Park Mine. But again, there's doubt now being cast on these specimens, because I think some of these were acquired by Harwood at that point, and then given to Bob, and those dates associated with them. So it may well be that Bob didn't spend all that long collecting in Wales. Certainly the South Wales quarries, they would be definite places which Bob had collected. The dates, again, 1970s and 1980s, normally fits with when he was doing collecting in that area. But this wonderful quartz from Minas in Snowdonia, this is one I always thought was self-collected by Bob, but I now know the full story. So although it says 1970 in his catalogue, it was purchased in 1970, job locked. There were probably 20 or more wonderful specimens which were discovered by climbers up in North Wales. Bob got wind of this discovery and sent, I think it was a mineral dealer, Roger Harker, who was based in Leicester, across to North Wales to buy the whole lot. And then once he got back, they distributed them amongst themselves. So there is, I was going to say unfortunately, but it's just how the story is told. But the history as we know it of Bob's collection does appear to be shifting to show that that not all the material he self-collected was actually found by him, and some of it was purchased or donated. Leicestershire, I've no doubt that he collected most of these himself, because it was so local, and he had such an interest in this area, and it was key to his research leading up to his submission of his PhD thesis on the mineralogy of Leicestershire. And most of the Leicestershire specimens he had were acquired later on, so probably 1960s and 70s. And this may coincide with the evening classes that were being run, and the fact that maybe some quarry owners, quarry managers came on board with these educational evenings, and then allowed access to the quarry workings, which maybe were previously inaccessible. Because certainly from the 1960s and 70s, large quantities of minerals came out of Leicestershire. Generally not hugely displayable. There are always exceptions, but most of it is kind of research grade, sort of scientific material. This is one exception. Analcine, sort of golf ball shaped crystals, which came from the bottom level of Croft Quarry back in the 1970s. Captain Amos Treloar was mine manager at Nensbury Hags mine up in Cumbria. I've mentioned him briefly previously under Walsh. He exchanged directly with Bob King. I know that now from this early catalogue that's come to light. But also Bob would have acquired Treloar specimens from the Walsh collection. And a lot of these are historic, so they're late 1800s. Similar in a way to the Goodchild collection, they appear to be late 1800s, early 1900s material. So nice old-time material. Harwood's collection, so he had lots of fabulous material from around the world, including Wales, because it should be remembered that Bob King's collection, although it was acquired by the National Museum of Wales, its strengths really lay elsewhere. So there would be Welsh material in there, nice Welsh material, but only a small number of specimens compared to the whole collection. But Harwood had beautiful calcites from Park Mine, sulfides, galena and sphalerite from Llanrwst, lots of malachites and chalcopyrites from Great Orme's Head, which was near to where he lived. But unfortunately, there's very few records kept because Harwood didn't tend to keep hold of the original labels as to what the history was behind them. As is this brookite, beautiful, beautiful and relatively large for the species, brown, orange-brown tabular crystal of brookite, but we don't know when exactly it was acquired. These are a few examples of the different wonderful forms of calcite from Park Mine and Castle Mine up near Llanrwst in the Conwy Valley. And the beautiful colours associated with the secondary lead and zinc and copper minerals of the Colbeck Fells in the Lake District. I said earlier that many collectors always assumed that Bob King self-collected all of these wonderful minerals from the Colbeck Fells, but it simply wasn't the case. And in fact, the plumber gumite there on the right, I've reason to believe, I need to check the numbers when I can finally get back into the museum and look at the collection again. But I believe that that's one of the ones that Bob had from Bootle Museum. So I don't think that was even part of Harwood's collection. I think that was from the museum on Merseyside. And the link is that the famous late 19th century mineral collectors, the Bryce Wright father and son team, who for a time lived in the Colbeck Fells, they also lived for a small number of years in Bootle. And they were renowned for hoovering up all of the very best samples from the Colbeck Fells. And I would almost put money on the fact that that plumber gumite came from Bryce Wright, either father or son, in some form or another, ended up going to Bootle Museum to then eventually be dispersed when the museum closed down and entering Bob's collection. Harwood's collection also had some old-time fakes. Now, you might think alarm bells, oh, why has he got fraudulent fake minerals? But it was quite common. So this is something I was educated with a number of years back. And these would have probably been Victorian fakes. So when anything is valuable, it's worth faking. If something's not worth much, there isn't any reason to spend time trying to fake something and make money out of it. It has to be something significant. Now, they're almost kind of historic specimens in their own right. So the apatite on the left, the apatite almost certainly did come from Carrick Mine, but during blasting operations, they almost always fell off. And so it's been faked because it's been glued back on in its original position. So you can argue that it's kind of just a composite, it's been repaired, but it's still faked because it was never recorded that's what happened. The one on the right is slightly more ingenious. So again, Carrick Mine, classic location, classic as in specimens are worth something, therefore they're worth faking. And the glossy scheelite crystal, the pyramidal thing on the right-hand side of that image, again, they almost always fell off the specimens when they were collected. And to reattach them, the miners or the collectors or the mineral dealers were quite clever in that they would grind up mica from the granitic matrix of the host rock, mix it with resin, and then stick the crystals back on, quite often not where they came off, but just to make it look authentic. If you shone an ultraviolet light on that specimen, you'd probably be able to see the glue showing up or the resin showing up. But very cleverly done. Most collectors wouldn't realise that's not how it should be. Cumbrian iron mines in the late 19th century were producing stunning calcites. These are a couple of the multitude of forms of calcite that came from the iron mines in Cumbria. The pencil-shaped crystals on the left from Wyndham Mine, and a heart-shaped twin, a very collectible mineral, very collectible form of calcite on the right there, and quite sizable. So the heart-shaped twin's 10 centimeters across, which is quite big for those twins. Barite, also from the iron mines. Large crystal on the left there, that's probably about 15, possibly 20 centimeters tall. The one on the right is much smaller, but it's got iron inclusions, so it gives it slightly more character. Obviously, from iron mines, you've got botryoidal hematites in the Harwood collection, multiple examples, some very large display quality specimens, and lots of bipyramidal quartz crystals, normally smoky, caused by inclusions, but typical of the form you'd expect for the iron mines in Cumbria. Moving across from Cumbria to Alston Moor in the North Pennines, this area was famous for barium mineralization. So we've got beautiful hexagonal witherite crystals on the left there from Treloar vein. Again, we mentioned Amos Treloar earlier as the mine captain. He had parts of the mine workings named after him. This would have been a specimen that probably came out in the 1920s. Whether or not it came through the hands of Treloar, very difficult to say for certain. And the two images on the right there show that Bob wasn't immune to wrongly labeling specimens. So we know that all of his specimens had his handwritten labels attached. Both of these have handwritten Bob King labels affixed to them. But the specimen at the top is supposed to be from Pennant Mine in Flintshire. The one at the bottom is supposed to be from the type locality, Brownlee Hill Mine in the North Pennines. But I would hazard a guess that they've been reversed. The labels have been stuck on the wrong specimens because the top specimen is an absolute dead ringer for a Brownlee Hill specimen, whereas the one on the bottom, although it's clearly Ulsternite, it is atypical of anything from the North Pennines. It's even got slightly pyritic matrix, and you can see where the specimen has been chiseled off. And Bob's story, because I quizzed him about these specimens before he died, was that the Pennant specimen he hammered off the edge of a wall near to the engine house at Pennant Mine. And certainly that lower specimen, which is labelled as Brownlee Hill Mine, looks like it's been hammered off a larger block, whereas the upper specimen looks like it's more of a floater. It's just come out of a cavity. So there are some labelling issues which have gone on, but it's rare. I mentioned fluorites. So Harwood's collection had stunning fluorites from the North Pennines, both from Northumberland in these examples, ranging from purples to murky green to other kind of insipid green shades from multiple different mines. So he seemed to have an example from every occurrence. In Weardale, classic purple, very large crystals from Boltzburn Mine. Also, specimens, and this one here was in Harwood's collection, but labelled as from Parkburn Heights Mine. But again, it's atypical of that particular mine. And if you look very carefully, the sandstone matrix and the fact the green fluorite cubes are faded suggests that it's probably a very early specimen which came from White's level in Middle Hope Shield Mine. And we know that mine level collapsed shortly after 1818, which would imply that this is a very, very old piece. Harwood also had really significant old-time classic material. So we've got lead chloride minerals from Derbyshire, so matlachite, little micaceous plates there on the left, and quite a stubby crystal of phosgenite on the right there, both from Bage Mine, famous locality. Cornwall, he had some super specimens from Cornwall, including this ginormous cogwheel bornonite, with the largest crystal there 5 centimeters across. Kleiner clays, so copper arsenates from Wheel Gorland. So Harwood seemed to have very much a systematic collection, one of everything. Beautiful ballista coppers from Cornwall. Also in Cornwall, various different forms of calcite and quartz. So we've got these hexagonal plates of calcite from Levant Mine on the left, and on the right, the wax-like form of chalcedony form of quartz from Pedden and Dray mine in Redruth. Moving over to Devon, large arsenopyrite crystals with siderite from Virtuous Lady mine, an absolute classic box epimorph. So a siderite epimorph after what one could only presume was a fluorite crystal, which is dissolved away, but really significant historic old-time specimens. In Devon, also classic examples of radiating waverlite from Highdown Quarry, Barnstaple, and another fake. So the one on the right here is a shawl, so a black tourmaline, with at the back, you can just about see out of focus, there's an apatite crystal on there. And these specimens mostly came from a small occurrence in Bovey Tracy in the early 1800s, and were very sought after and very rare, but most of the crystals were isolated. So they'd fallen off rotted granitic matrix and were loose. Well, this specimen is actually made of mortar, where all the tourmaline crystals and the apatite have been stuck in the mortar to make a cabinet-sized piece, when in fact they're all from the same locality, so they're all from a genuine occurrence, but the specimen has been constructed to make it obviously more valuable than what it would be as individual crystals. Scotland as well, so some huge specimens from Wanlock Head. This calcite is 25 centimetres across, and Harwood had multiple examples of these calcites. Beautiful orange or yellow tipped barite from Wanlock Head, very, very rare specimen, that one on the right. A few more calcites. There's a calcite on the right there and a sphalerite. Again, Harwood had lots and lots of sphaleриtes from Lead Hills. So obviously knew how to get hold of these things. Also had a few more slightly more unusual things. So greenachite, so cadmium sulfide from the Bishopston Railway cutting just outside Glasgow. Now, although this is listed as Harwood's, I have a suspicion that in flicking through these new catalogues that have come to light, that this grenachite is actually a good child specimen which came via Walsh. So that would fit with the date, sort of pre-1873. So it's one I need to investigate the provenance behind. Freynites on the left there, whole range of different occurrences Harwood had examples from. I suppose it's not particularly rare mineral, but quite attractive nevertheless. Zeolites, so stilbites from Isle of Skye were well represented in Harwood's collection, as well as the more unusually coloured sort of red to salmon pink stilbites from the Kilpatrick area of Strathclyde. But the pièce de la résistance of Harwood's collection were the Kongsberg silvers. So these are, without a shadow of a doubt, the most valuable aspect of Harwood's collection. Other parts of his World Classics series, I've mentioned before the 900 or so cassiterite specimens, his alpine quartzes, as well as his systematic collection, where he tried by exchanging with collectors around the world to essentially collect one of everything. He was a chemist by training, reader in chemistry at university, and yeah, his passion led to his collecting habits as well. So there wasn't just one Kongsberg silver, there were four main specimens. And if we think back to the valuations, the valuation 19,500 in 1975 for Harwood's collection, these four specimens in their own right by 1983 were valued at 27,500. You can extrapolate that up with modern prices, but if you're familiar with mineral specimens being sold, any of these specimens, if you saw them for sale on the internet nowadays, would have POA or POR associated with them, which means price on application or price on request, or to you and I, if you have to ask, you can't afford it. Classics, so cassiterite, I say worldwide localities, particularly well represented was Cornwall, as you'd expect, but every country in the world that produced tin, because of Harwood's work during the First World War in surveying resources of tin, he appeared to go above and beyond by collecting examples from every possible occurrence. Other classics from around the world, we have a bit washed out pink. It's slightly darker pink in real life. A fluorite from the Alps in Switzerland at the top there. Rhodonites, so manganese silicate from Broken Hill, New South Wales. Kyanite, so lovely blue kyanite from the Alps, Switzerland. So the list kind of goes on in terms of classic world minerals that Harwood had. Vanadinites from Arizona. These would now have obviously been surpassed by the vanadinites that came out of Morocco in the late 20th century. But when Bob and Harwood were collecting, the vanadinites from Arizona were some of the world's best. And disclosite, big examples of this from Namibia. So large collection of those. And Bob, sort of long before he passed away, was lucky enough to have a mineral named in his honor. And it was a mineral, quite an unusual formula, so copper, lead, chlorite with hydroxide and water within its structure, which had been discovered at Newcliff Hill Quarry in the large lumps of native copper that had been found there. And because it was a new mineral, because it was associated with Leicestershire, and Bob had done so much work in describing the mineralogy of Leicestershire, he had this mineral named after him. Not many specimens, as far as I'm aware, in existence. It's extremely rare. So just a few acknowledgements. Obviously Bob King, who died 7 years ago now. I had many discussions with him regarding his collection and snippets of information about the collectors associated with it. So very useful, very helpful discussions. His widow, so Sally King, for obviously conversations in the past, but also for providing me with access to this very early collection catalogue, which neither Sally or I were aware of, which is groundbreaking in terms of what we can find out from it, and also for providing me with the photographs of Raymond Walsh and Wilbert Goodchild. Dr. Helen Kirby, who used to be at the museum with me, for her original research into Harwood's Harwood's part of the King collection in the early 2000s. University of Manchester and Manchester Museum for their online information about Harwood, because they've obviously got half of his collection. David Green for the use of the Bob Kingite image. Roy Starkey for his notes and discussions with Bob. He had similar discussions to me, and a few other sort of snippets of information. And to Neil Hubbard for his conversations about introducing me to historic fake specimens, which was certainly an eye-opener, and certainly makes you look twice at specimens to try and work out whether they're genuine or not. But if I can work out how to share this back, I will then allow any questions. Okay.
Thank you very much. That was a tour de force, wasn't it? Wow.